Yes, hello everyone. Warm welcome to this webinar on the topic Africa's regulatory frameworks and pathways for vaccine clinical trials, licensure, and post-market monitoring. My name is Clive Nyaribo, Project Coordinator for the Vaccine Workforce Development Program. I work closely with the project co-leads, Professor George Warime and Marianne Mnene. Before we get started, a few housekeeping matters. Kindly take note that this webinar is being recorded. Kindly feel free to use the chat option to share your questions during the presentation, and we'll address them during the Q&A session. We'll have a few open slots for the attendees to directly ask questions to the presenters. If your internet is stable, you can raise your hand using the fireball icon. Please note that the high note takers and automated transcription tools are not permitted in this session. Unauthorized ports will be removed. These are a series of planned webinars with the goal of providing information on various topics in the field of vaccinology. This being under the KEMRI-Wellcome Trust Research Program, which is a well-known health research unit of excellence. Over the years, we have excelled in the use of novel ideas and collaborations to achieve better health for Africa, while also developing African scientific leaders. Our vision of the program is to undertake cutting-edge and novel research relevant to national, regional, and global needs. The Vaccine Workforce Development Program is funded by the Gates Foundation and aims to expand the technical know-how and capability for sustainable end-to-end vaccine R&D and manufacturing in Africa through training and knowledge exchange activities in the vaccine ecosystem through a multidisciplinary and partnership approach. Reason why this is important is that Africa currently relies on vaccine imports and vaccine donations for up to 99% of its routine immunization needs. The Vaccine Workforce Development Program is investing in local talent and strengthening technical expertise, thus building manufacturing capability to improve vaccine access and reduce dependence. The Vaccine Workforce Development Program has 4 core initiatives. One, we have the Vaccinology School Engagement Program, where students from local secondary schools are engaged during open days and lab tours with career talks to spark the interest in vaccinology and careers within this field. 2, we have the vaccinology webinars like this one, where area career scientists, graduate and undergraduate university students across the globe join webinars that provide information on various topics in the field of vaccinology. 3, we have the Vaccinology in Africa course, which is an annual master's level course that attracts participants from across the continent for strengthening theoretical knowledge on vaccinology. 4, we also have biomanufacturing apprenticeships that provide hands-on training in vaccine manufacturing facilities across the globe. Today, we are going to have Dr. David Mukanga, who will be addressing or discussing the topic Africa's regulatory frameworks and pathways for vaccine clinical trials, licensure, and post-market monitoring. Dr. David Mukanga is a Deputy Director, Africa Regulatory Systems and Clinical at the Gates Foundation, where he leads the Foundation's Africa Regulatory System Optimization Portfolio and linkage between regulatory systems and healthcare services. In this role, David supports the development of harmonized, transparent, and predictable regulatory systems covering the life cycle of medical products in Africa across the national, regional, and continental levels of the ecosystem. His work also involves support for regulatory emergence preparedness and development of a vibrant clinical research ecosystem in Africa. David served as the first chair of the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Partners Platform, a partner collective of more than 30 funders, technical and advocacy partners working to support Africa advance its regulatory capabilities. David serves as a co-chair of the funder group for Africa's regulatory systems as advisor to a number of global initiatives and on the board of the Drug Information Association. Dr. David has a combined 28 years of experience spanning regulatory affairs, health systems, development, academia, clinical research, and product development. Prior to joining the Gates Foundation in 2013, David was the founding CEO of the Africa Field Epidemiology Network, AVNet, and served on faculty at Makerere University. David received his professional training in pharmacy and public health at Makerere University, epidemiology from the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and a PhD in international health from the Karolinska Institute. Over to you, David.
Clive, thank you very much for that overview and introduction. I'm pleased to meet everybody. It would be nice for me to get to know who is in the room very briefly, just to get a flavor of where everybody is coming from. I know, we have quite a number of people on the line. Clive, do you want to give me a sense, perhaps not an introduction of everyone, but at least a sense of where the group is coming from and their experiences? That will help me to customize the delivery as well?
Yes, I can also give them an opportunity to use the chat option, but basically you'll have a wide audience from past experiences, and even now you have audience from research institutes, including the KEMRI-Wellcome Trust research program in Kilifi. You'll have university students from various universities within Kenya and Africa at large. Yes, and you'll have people interested in the field of vaccinology from across Africa. Yes, but participants are also encouraged to can use the chat option and type where you are from currently.
Yeah. In the chat, thanks, Clive. If you can put your name and your affiliation or what you're working on at the moment would be very good for me to get a flavor of that and just know who is in the room. Great. So we have about an hour together, and I will use this time really to just provide an overview of this area, and then we can get into a discussion. I want to make sure that I'm leaving sufficient time for Q&A and for discussion. I did share this material in advance, so those of you that have had a look at it, that's fantastic. Those that have not, no worries. I have left a bit of material in the annex in the interest of time, just for additional information, and happy to cover that area when we get into the Q&A as well. So I'm based out of Nairobi. That's where I normally work from. I'm in London today, but I'm normally based out of our Nairobi office. So I just wanted to start, given that I work for the Gates Foundation, to give you a little bit of background around why we're in this business and what we do before we get into the regulatory frameworks themselves. So last week, DevEx published an article. I had a sit down with one of their editors based in Nairobi, Sarah Javing, and she published an article on why the Gates Foundation is pushing for stronger health product regulators on the continent, including the AMA. So some reading for you there. I've provided the link to the article. Enjoy the read. But I also want to give you a little bit of context. This slide basically is telling us that if you compare the African continent with China, India, and other parts of the world, that our healthcare spend is pretty low. Yes, we have a very large population. Our GDP is pretty relatively much lower than other parts of the world, translating into low healthcare spending. And if you develop a vaccine anywhere in the world, if you want to bring that vaccine to the continent, unfortunately, you've got to deal with 55 regulators to get that legally authorized for importation and use in the country. So those are huge disincentives that I just want to put out there to make it very clear that, with the continent disadvantages itself very strongly because of this context. And one has to bear that in mind, that if you are a vaccine producer, even on the African continent, you will have to deal with 55 regulators, including your own country, to bring your product across the market, whether to children or other segments of the population. So we have, in the last year and a half, working with our leadership, I went to articulate to them, why this situation cannot pertain, and challenged our leadership to invest a little bit in changing this situation. Of course, working with the African continent, with thought input from the African Union and colleagues across the continent. I try to paint this picture to our leadership to say, look, we can today, if you develop a vaccine, you ideally need to go either through the WHO pre-qualification program, or you go through non-African WHO listed agencies, or what used to be called stringent regulators. I'm in the middle, on the left side of this slide at the bottom. You know, that's the current pathway really today, before you come to the continent through the 55, and making the case that we need to build on the continent mature regulators that are operating at the WHO listed authority level for medicines, vaccines, potentially medical devices as well, and that those then can be anchors for an African medicines agency that is being created. So, you know, a product could go through the WLF for a vaccine, go to the AMA, and then go to the continent, or directly from the WLA, as you know, the arrow at the top there shows, directly to the 55 regulators. And in the future, if the continent so decided that the AMA, you know, acquires a binding mandate, then it becomes much, much easier. You have an AMA authorization, and the product can be made available across the continent, whether vaccines, other biologicals, other more complex medical products that the AMA would deal with. But even outside the AMA, if you having a WLA on the continent, then the rest of the continent can rely on those WHO listed authorities, rather than, you know, they can continue to collaborate, the continent, with others, the Europeans, the Americans, the Japanese, etc. But the continent needs to mature its own regulatory capabilities. And so this is a picture of, you know, the partnership that we're trying to build with the continent's regulators, you know, where we are today, that, you know, a company has to go through those different hoops to get to the patient. And on the right side is sort of the moonshot of what it could be. You know, whether that will be, we don't know. But I think if even the transition part here makes life much, much more less complicated, and improves access to medicines. And I'll be happy to take questions on that slide. Yeah, and just for those of you that may not be aware, the Africa Medicines Agency received its first Director General in October last year. This is an image of her, to the lady to the left, being received by Rwanda's leadership, President Kagame, the Minister of Health, and people from his office. And Clive did mention the partner collective. I serve on that partner collective, and you can see some of the partners there. We have had this partnership for a couple of years now, about 8 years, that brings the partners together to be very coordinated as we work with the African community to advance regulatory capabilities on the continent. So I'll go into the business of the day, why we regulate vaccines. So, I mean, every other product needs to be regulated, but our focus today is on vaccines, and you know, why there's a lot more stringency in this area is that, first of all, you know, unlike small molecules, vaccines are generally that are administered to sick individuals. Prophylactic vaccines, especially, are generally administered to large healthy populations. So the risk-benefit balance is much more complex here. You know, you are administering a foreign substance into people that are healthy. You know, if you're sick, if you have a cancer that, you know, the natural history of that disease indicates, you know, your survival is a year or two, you know, and there is a product that can potentially be life-saving for you. The discussions around the risk-benefit balance are very, very different from, you know, a product that is being administered to you in the hope that it would protect you from something that you don't yet have, that you might never come into contact with. So, although subject to the same regulations as other biologicals, but vaccines are inherently more difficult also to develop, to characterize, and to manufacture. So the issues around the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls as well become much more complicated around these products. And also due to the biological production of vaccines, and the risk for variability between lots, then, for this type of products, as we'll see later, then there is this requirement for every lot or every batch to be tested before it is released. We don't do that for small molecules. You don't test every lot, every batch that you produce. My slide is not moving. Okay. And certainly then, because of the value that they bring to public health and their wide-scale use, it's important for that transparency to be there to build trust. We've all seen the growing vaccine hesitancy over the last few years, especially, during the COVID era and even after, globally, including especially in the US and so on. We're seeing emergence of things like measles that people had not seen in the US for a long time. And that's because of that broken public trust, and people questioning the safety of vaccines. So it's a very important area, and yet these are critical tools, very critical public health tools, perhaps some of the most powerful public health tools that exist out there, and so it's very important that public trust is maintained, that there is a very clear engagement, that people understand that there's a high level of transparency in the way that regulators make decisions. So if you look, for example, at the US FDA, they will have, in addition to their own experts, they will bring experts from the outside. There's advisory committees that will have academics from various institutions that are trusted. There will be public consultations, to discuss. There will be patient groups that are involved, in saying, look, not in this case, but where you have patients involved, that even that group too is involved. But in the case of vaccines, public consultations, advisory committees contributing into the discourse. And so we will touch a bit on that process, very much focusing on the clinical marketing authorization. But as we all know, product development starts with the preclinical phase and gets into the clinical, and once you have that evidence from your pivotal studies, then you can take that, put together your package and take to make a case for marketing authorization. So we'll cover parts of this life cycle, especially from the clinical to the right side of this slide. So we'll start with clinical trials for those of you who are in this space. And just like other products, these are conducted to rigorously evaluate, whether new vaccine candidates are safe, are effective, capable of producing the desired immune response in humans primarily, but there will also be other cases where, there will be arguments, even when a vaccine already exists. There will be cases where you need to do clinical trials, especially to look at efficacy when people are looking at, dose sparing strategies. You are giving 3 doses of human papilloma, and now, you're saying, actually 2 doses are as effective as 3, and you want to do a non-inferiority study to demonstrate that, so it will be an existing vaccine, but because you're making the case to say, look, for us to be able to deliver this to the population that needs it, we need to drive down the cost, and we believe that we can reduce the dose from 3 to 2, and you want to show that actually there's a good justification, from either, existing real-world evidence or others, that actually there might be a case for a 2-dose schedule as opposed to a 3-dose, a 1-dose versus 2-dose, and so on and so forth. So it's not always that you do clinical trials for a new vaccine, but it may be to answer certain questions as well as you begin to implement and generate real-world evidence data that suggests certain improvements that could be made. I will not attempt to take you through an ethics course, but just to remind everybody of the global standards that govern vaccine trials and the history of that, from the Nuremberg Code to the Declaration of Helsinki, and we have now the CIOMS guidelines and the International Council of Harmonization, ICH, the Good Clinical Practice, E6 3R, and so on and so forth. So these are documents that are out there, and you should interest yourself in being familiar with this if you have an interest in vaccine clinical trials. And we are in no way attempting to get into the design of vaccine clinical trials. That's not the attempt of the course today, but just to give you an overview of you know, what the standards that are out there and things that you need to bear in mind. And then on the African continent, something that may be specific if you're going to get involved in doing multi-country clinical trials, again, because of the challenges that we mentioned earlier of multiple country, multiple regulators. If you're going to do a vaccine trial in China, you deal with one regulator and you roll out your vaccine trial. If you're going to do a vaccine trial in the US, you deal, of course, with the ethics bodies at, you know, the research sites where you're going to do the study. But in terms of the regulator, you deal with the US FDA, one regulator. If you're going to do a study in multiple countries on the continent, you have to deal with the IRBs at the institutions, then you have national ethics committees, then you have the office of the presidency in certain countries, then you have the national regulator. All these things can be disincentives for people to conduct or bring clinical trials on the African continent. So there's been an effort coordinated by the WHO called the Africa Vaccine Regulatory Forum, and I apologize for the acronyms here, too many acronyms. AVRF stands for the Africa Vaccine Regulators Forum, started in 2006, one, to try to address this harmonization question in terms of standards. Secondly, where a study is happening in multiple countries, try to do a single review or what they call a joint review of that study with the regulators and ethics bodies in those countries, and come to potentially a single decision or scientific opinion on that clinical trial application. So these are some examples. There are a lot more, but some examples of trials that have gone through the AVRF platform. Some products that you're very familiar with, the R21 malaria vaccine that was sponsored by Oxford, and currently the M72 TB vaccine that is going on in 5 countries. 3 of those were through a joint review, Kenya included, Malawi and Zambia through AVRF. South Africa on the African continent was not part of that. They had started the review earlier, and then Indonesia in Asia. Those are the 5 countries that make up the M72 trial. And so on the right side, AVRF has encouraged the simultaneous, or what's called a parallel submission. So rather than getting your ethics approval and then you go to the regulator, submit at the same time to both ethics and regulatory. Then collectively got the continent to agree to a 60-day decision timeline that, you know, we should all aim to do our reviews and complete them within 60 days. If you look today, China is highly competitive in terms of their throughput of medical innovation. In 2025, about 35% of all new chemical entities came out of China. And part of the reason for that is their efficient regulatory system. You get a decision within 30 days to start your clinical trial or not to start your clinical trial. And the US now is thinking about how to retweak its system to be competitive with China. We are lagging behind. Even the 60 days is not competitive at all. Europe is 1 to 2 months at the most. Many African countries don't hit those 60 days. It's 6 months, 9 months that they will take. There are a few that do well, you know. And then the AVRF also started the scientific advice and you know, addressing duplication and redundancies across the continent. I think a lot of this you're familiar with, why clinical trials need to happen on the continent, the genetic diversity, etc., etc. I'll not go into that, but just leave that with you. And then this next slide, the 6 non-negotiables for ethical vaccine trials on the continent, you know, things that we all need to be aware of and need to strengthen tomorrow if you're the head of an institution and you have an ethics board, please make sure that that ethics board is funded and strengthened and supported, because it plays a critical role. And if it's not well resourced, it's going to move inefficiently. It's going to slow down, the review of clinical trials coming into your institution, and overall make our ecosystem uncompetitive. Okay. Let me pause there and see if there is one or two questions. I'll take one or two questions and then continue. Any burning question? Unfortunately, can't see your hands, so you just need to speak up.
Yes, you can use the verbal icon. Ask your question. Yes, just one question, David. Because we have launched very ambitious plans as the continent. We have the Achieve that was launched this year, advocating for local manufacturing. And as you know, we only have 2 NRAs that are ML3 vaccines. So where does that leave us in terms of our local production efforts, especially when we talk of regulatory affairs? Yeah, thank you.
Very good question. Very good, very good question. I think that takes us back to this vision that I was trying to paint earlier, that if you have a WLA for vaccines on the continent, that can be an anchor. At the moment, for example, the National Quality Control Labs are talking about reliance for lot release, that if you produce a vaccine in Kenya, you don't have to have all the laboratory capabilities for the testing and lot release. You could have some assays that you run there that you're good at, but you could leverage, for example, there's an ML4 vaccine lab in Bloemfontein in South Africa. There is a lab in Egypt, at ML3. You could leverage those. So there is an effort underway to create a network called the NAL, the National Reliance Laboratories for Africa, that would, be relied upon. So the regulator in Rwanda, for example, will say, I want to go to maturity level 4 or maturity level 3 for vaccines, but I don't have a lab. But I enter into a memorandum of understanding to say the lab in South Africa or Egypt or Senegal, when that's up and running, I will use those to do my lot release, my lot testing, and my lot release. So that is the kind of leverage thinking that is going on right now. That's for me, that's the way to go, and that's how the continent is thinking about these things. But of course, if Kenya wants to build its own lab, that's fine. But again, the efficiencies of these sort of things and so forth become quite challenging. How do you keep that lab warm? If you have one vaccine manufacturer, you have one vaccine, you're producing 2 or 3 lots a year. You have a whole team and enterprise to do 2 lot tests and releases a year. Is just not economically viable. So that's some of the thinking around that. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for such a comprehensive answer. There is a question on the chat from Michelle. Do you know the timeline for NRLs? I think it's the same, but you can provide more context.
Please, you can voice over as I'm trying to find the question.
Yes, if we can have Michelle to provide more context, do you know the timeline for NRLs?
Or for the NAL,
Yes,
that I was just describing. It's NARL, NARL, the NAL. So it's underway. The discussions. The labs have already sat and defined the governance framework of how they want to govern themselves. The operational framework has not yet been defined in terms of, who will pay for the reagents, who will pay for the transfers, etc. Do you enter service level agreement? Those more, granular details are being fleshed out, but the overall overarching principle has been agreed. we supported these labs to visit the EDQM, the European Directorate of Quality of Medicines in Strasbourg last year, because that's what Europe does. You know, even Europe with all its capabilities, Germany doesn't do all the assays at the Paul Ehrlich or Cinzano in Belgium. You know, they rely on each other. There is the network called the OMCL laboratories that leverage each other across Europe. You know, so they know, you know, if you want to do this type of assay, these guys in Brussels are quite strong, you know, and these guys in Germany are quite strong. So they'll have like 2 centers across the 27 countries that do a certain assay and depend on them to do those assays and really build their expertise. So that's the same kind of thinking potentially that would happen here, that you have one lead lab and you have one that, you know, you build some redundancy in case something happens in one, but, you know, for the whole continent, you have a few labs to do that. So that's with the NAL. The AVREF is in discussion with the AMA because that work is going to transition to the AMA. So there is a plan, as you might know, last month, the WHO and the AMA, Dr. Tedros and the head of the AMA signed a cooperation framework between WHO and the AMA. So the transition of AVREF into AMA is going to be a part of that. And to my understanding, this will happen before the end of the year. They're going to flesh out which aspects will transfer to the AMA and which aspects will continue to be coordinated by WHO, potentially capacity building and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's what I know. The time frame is potentially by the end of the year. Okay, let's drive on a little bit here.
Yes, thank you. There is a question on the Q&A, but we'll address it later.
Okay. So vaccine licensure. So this is where now you have finished your clinical trials, you have your efficacy, safety, and quality data, and now you bring that to the regulator to say, you know, I want you to authorize this product to enter the market. And certainly there, then you're looking at demonstrated safety data from phase 1, even if actually the non-clinical the data starts there, you know, the non-clinical packet, the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 data, you know, the efficacy data that you have, the quality in terms of the manufacturing, the consistency of the manufacturing process, and so on. And then, you know, the regulators then look at the evidence that you have, the benefits that your product will accrue to the population, the target population, and the risks that are there, you know, and then make those judgments, you know, whether this is something that they want to allow to be introduced onto the market. And so, again, depends on, there are different types of regulatory pathways. I put in the annex, which I'll not cover here, how you choose your filing strategy, you know, for the vaccine. It's very important that you think about that, but you have a national pathway where you can go straight to the national regulator and file your vaccine application. So, for example, you know, BioVac in South Africa or Aspen in South Africa will go to SAPRA and seek a marketing authorization for their vaccine. Or a vaccine produced in China, you go to NMPA in China and seek your marketing authorization there. You know, then there is what we call the facilitated pathways, where, you know, it's one step before you get to the national. So the national is relying on somebody else who's done the assessment, not necessarily in terms of abdicating their responsibility, but they leverage the work that has been done. So you look at the assessment reports, the inspection reports that somebody else has done, and use that to make your own decision. You may do what is called an abridged review. You know, you may still decide to go and inspect the factory, but at least you use the information that's available from another regulator if they are willing to share that information, because that can be another issue as well in terms of accessing those assessment and inspection reports. And so in the annex, you will see that it's very important to think about who is going to pay for the vaccine to determine your filing strategy. So, for example, if you have produced a vaccine and it's a childhood, an EPI vaccine, and you want Gavi is going to be the primary payer for that, you have to go to PQ, because Gavi will not purchase a vaccine that's not WHO pre-qualified. So you have to think about that route. Or is it a new chemical entity, or has it been out licensed? A company will produce a new vaccine and then give a license to a developing country manufacturer to produce a copy, so to speak, of the vaccine and make that available to LMIC markets. And so I leave some principles here around these facilitated pathways. WHO PQ is a good example. The Medicines for All, the European Medicines Agency pathway, the Swiss Medic marketing authorization for global health products, the Merck GHP is another facilitated pathway that exists out there and that have been very, very effective in driving access to vaccines and other products. And then, of course, on the continent, the AMA is going to be one once its review pathways are active. That's a typo in 2027, Q1 of 2027. Then that will become another pathway there. Some information here on the WHO pre-qualification program, why it was set up. Essentially, if you want your vaccine to be purchased by UNICEF, Gavi, which are the big suppliers for our EPI programs, those vaccines need to be WHO pre-qualified, and that's the quality assurance mechanism that these global payers have agreed to. Things will probably change in the coming years as increasingly LMIC governments have to invest and pay for their own products. Now, this is why if you produce a vaccine, and we're talking about manufacturing, if you produce a vaccine in the country, it's very important that your regulator is at maturity level 3. Why? Because as opposed to medicines, you can produce medicines and supply the world even when your regulator is not at maturity level 3. And you can be WHO pre-qualified even when your medicines regulator is not maturity level 3, like India and China. Their regulators are not maturity level 3. But a lot of medicines from China and India are WHO pre-qualified. But for vaccines, the regulator must be maturity level 3 because of the lot release point, that the WHO would rely on that local regulator to do the lot testing and the lot release for each lot that comes off the production line. So that's a nuance to just take note there, why it is imperative. If a manufacturer in your country is targeting the global procurers and therefore wants to go to the PQ route, your regulator must be maturity level 3 for vaccines. Maturity level 3 for vaccines, not for medicines. Maturity level 3 for vaccines, for that to be eligible. A little description here of how these facilitated regulatory pathways work. So you file with the regulator of record of PQ. Once you have your authorization or your listing, then you submit to the national regulator the full dossier, the assessment report, and then the regulator uses that to make their marketing authorization decision. Then a little bit on the dossier, for those of you who may be meeting this for the first time, this is how the dossier globally has been agreed to be structured. It's structured in 5 modules, 1 to 5. What is called the Common Technical Document that was agreed by the International Council for Harmonization. So you have module 1, which is very regional specific, administrative, etc. This way you can define things like labeling, etc. that could be different, but then the rest is very much standard. Module 2, which is the overall, what's called the course, the quality overall summary. It has the non-clinical, it has the clinical and the quality part. And then module 3, which then goes into the details of the quality data, module 4, and then module 5 as described there. So the quality part, then this is really focused on the understanding of the production process, the quality control methods that you have used, the production consistency at commercial scale. It's very easy to control when you're dealing with a small volume test, clinical trial volumes. When you get to mass production, is a very different ball game. So regulators who want to understand that, you know, how you're dealing with your data is very, very important. Is there an audit trail? Can we come and see how you've done your quality control, your production, the evidence, the data is there, it's well kept, it's not tampered with, and so on and so forth. Issues around purity become important. Issues around sterility become very, very, very important. Then, of course, the clinical data, which generally has been produced by the original developer of the vaccine, the immunogenicity, the efficacy, effectiveness, the safety data, you know, that has already been generated a lot from the original developer. But for each vaccine, if you produce another vaccine, you know, if even if it has been out licensed, you know, you still need to do a little bit of work around these elements to demonstrate you know, the purity, the safety, the sterility of your product, the production, and so on and so forth. And sometimes the original producer may not share all the know-how, the IP, the full IP of the manufacturing process. So, you know, in these situations, sometimes you may even have to repeat some of these clinical, do some bridging studies around the clinical as well. Then the assessment of the manufacturing process also is a part of that, and often then, you know, this involves actually doing an inspection of the manufacturing facility to really understand how the facility has been set up and how you're meeting all these international standards that assure that when you produce the product, it's consistent. You know, there are no impurity issues. There are no sterility or lack of sterility questions there. Then we have already explained why you need to do lot release for each batch. So a little bit more information here, but that's something that's really critical, that for each batch that there is a lot testing and lot release. However, globally also under the WHO, it's been agreed that it doesn't make sense for every importing country then to demand or to do a lot release, because this takes time and it's very costly. It can take weeks, it can even take months, 2 to 3 months, you know. So if a vaccine has a shelf life of 3 years and every country wants to do a lot testing and, you know, and so on, it's going to be very expensive on the manufacturer. It's going to cost a lot of time. Perhaps the batch might even expire before it is shipped to certain countries. You can imagine if each country is requiring that. So that's why it's very important that that regulator where the vaccine is produced does their job to produce the data, the lot release data, and make it available to other regulators to rely on that, because then they're depending on that regulator for their confidence and assurance before they release that vaccine onto the market. However, they could do certain tests when the vaccine comes into the market. If you suspect there was a breach in the cold chain, you can look at potency testing and things like that, but not the full lot testing and release. And then very briefly, we'll cover the post-market area, really important. I think what I want to emphasize here, especially for you who are in academia, that this is not an academic exercise. It's very important, as you know, vaccines as other medical products in the clinical trial phase. It's a very small number of volunteers that participate in these trials. And so for events that are rare, you will not see them in the clinical trial. And so the post-market phase is just as important to assure that the product is safe, it's well tolerated, and so on and so forth, and that these rare events, if they're there, are picked up and reported, not to necessarily to stop the use of the vaccine, but it may require changing of the label. It might be that it's not appropriate in a certain subset of the population, and so on and so forth. So the label may be modified based on post-market data, or the use of the product may be completely stopped and the product is recalled because of the post-market data that comes in. And it's a requirement of the marketing authorization holder collect that data, collaborate with providers and patients, gather that data, make it available to the regulator, and so on. So for those of you, I initially thought this was just a KEMRI community, some takeaway messages that I leave for you there. If you're involved in multi-country trials, that early engagement with AVAREF is important for you to look at pharmacovigilance, not as a science and not just administrative of completing forms and reporting back. It's a whole science there and an opportunity to really understand how a vaccine, just like any product, actually works and plays out in real life once you roll it out in the population. And for you to invest in the ethics capabilities of your institutions, early community engagement, and to contribute to shaping of global standards. So thank you very much. I think I have overrun the time. We have another 10 minutes or so for Q&A. So back to you all. Thank you.
Yes, David, thank you for such an insightful presentation. We'll go to the Q&A session, but we have more minutes, not just 10 minutes. We're about 30 now, but let's see.
Okay.
Yes, we'll start from the Q&A section. There is a question from Karim. What regulatory frameworks are needed to evaluate next generation vaccines, including mRNA, DNA, and AI-designed vaccine platforms?
No, great question. So as new innovative vaccines are developed, this is where it becomes very important again, this collaboration between regulators among themselves and even the industry, because the innovation is coming from industry. So if the regulators just sit on the one hand and say, we will decide, how to do, the test methods and things like that, a lot of those have been developed by the manufacturers. So this is where regulators need to collaborate with the manufacturer and say, let's understand, how are you controlling for this? How are you, ensuring that production is going on well on the production side, but also in terms of even the design of the studies, scientific advice being a very standard engagement framework between the sponsor of the study, the PI, and the regulator. These are pretty standard in high income regulatory authorities. I've attended some of these with the EMA particularly, where developers are coming and saying, this is how we're thinking about the methods and so forth. The regulator is actually learning, but the regulator is giving initial feedback to the developer and getting ready and getting prepared, when that clinical trial ultimately comes, when ultimately the marketing authorization dossier comes to them 3 years down the road, to update their thinking, update their understanding, update their guidance, and then taking that, if the International Council for Harmonization is very, very well organized. They have these working committees between regulators and industry, and topics such as these new innovative designs, etc. For example, adaptive designs in clinical trials. These have been discussed at ICH and so on. So very good discourse there, but also within the regulators themselves and WHO developing that. And the WHO technical series is a very good resource in terms of guidance around clinical trials, marketing authorization, and so on and so forth. I've not looked at them very recently, but the WHO technical series would be a good reference to go to, and it's ICH and WHO that then our regulators generally use and adapt those guidances into their own guidelines and so on that are used locally. AI is a very interesting one. I think that's very evolving. I'm not sure I have the crystal ball on that, but both industry and regulators are very actively looking at the use of AI, and both in terms of design, but also in terms of how you regulate, so clinical trial that has been designed AI-assisted design of a clinical trial. You know, how do you deal with that? Even dossier that have been written by AI. How do you look at that, and how do you evaluate that? I'm not sure I have answers to that, but these are big open questions that that the community is dealing with.
Thank you. There is a question also from Terry. With the establishment of AMA, will vaccines that are already WHO pre-qualified still require AMA joint review before registration in African member states?
No, I think that's a straight one. So that's part of the WHO AMA framework that I described. That's one of the elements. There is the collaboration between the AMA and PQ. So no, if the vaccine has been already pre-qualified by WHO or any product for that matter that is in the scope of the AMA, and we didn't talk about the AMA is not going to cover all products. A small set of products, about 10% of the essential medicines list. So the reason the AMA was set up is to bring the aggregate the limited capabilities of the African continent in terms of regulatory science together, so that those capabilities are leveraged to assess more complex products. So your generics will not come to the AMA, but vaccines, cell gene therapy, monoclonals, those type of products will come to the AMA. But what we understand from our conversations with them is products that are in the scope of WHO PQ, because WHO PQ also has its scope. Products that are in the scope of PQ will not be eligible, at least initially, for the AMA as they build up and mature and so forth. However, if the vaccine is produced on the African continent, and again, this is to be determined, they have said, locally manufactured products, locally meaning continentally manufactured products, would be in the scope of the AMA. So those conversations are ongoing between the AMA and the national. So, if a vaccine is produced in South Africa or in Senegal, Senegal has its regulator, so if that regulator is maturity level 3 for vaccines, they're not yet, but they will be. So when they are, and they have assessed the site and done the inspection for that yellow fever vaccine from the serum, from the Institute Pasteur in Dakar, what's the role of the AMA there, so I don't know what that specifically what that role would be, but those are ongoing discussions. Yeah.
Thank you. You can use the available icon to ask your question, and we'll give you the chance to ask it. There is a question also from Sarata. How do regulators navigate the issue of market access and navigate competition in the sustainability of vaccine production in Africa?
Okay, I can see the questions now. Great. The issue of market access and competition. So it's a good question, but I'm not sure that's for regulators. I think, I know that the topic around local production is a big topic. It's highly, has a lot of political capital around it, etc., etc. But I think we also need to think very carefully around what's the role of a regulator. The role of the regulator is to look at a product and say, does it meet my standards? Set the standards and say, does the product meet my quality, safety, efficacy standards or performance standards? If it's not, it is a medical device, for example, but not to be adjudicating who should be accessing the market and not accessing the market. Honestly, for me, that's what I believe. You play your role, you set the standards and make sure that those standards are being met. Yes, there's a lot of political pressure to say, let's support our local manufacturers, etc., and let the trade guys deal with that. If they want to put tariffs or not, that's their business. But the regulator should be playing their role to ensure that what comes on the market, either locally produced or imported, meets quality standards. And we see on the continent even, local producers that are producing product. I will not mention countries, but products that don't meet the standard. We've seen some of the post-market data from regulators, of not vaccines, but medicines, that are really substandard, low quality, I wouldn't say falsified, but very low quality, locally produced, and yet historically regulators have argued and said, when the local production is there, it's easier for me to go and inspect the facility and put sanctions as compared to somebody that's very far away in Asia, and so on and so forth. But we see the contrary, because there's a lot of political pressure in some of these places. Some of the owners of these facilities have friends high up in the circles, so they'll play those games. In some places it works, sometimes it doesn't. So locally produced is not a silver bullet. Let the regulator play their role, ensure they set the standards and ensure people uphold those standards, and let somebody else deal with the issue of how do you facilitate and enable local production. And there's great value in that, and there are many good reasons beyond just even security, supply chain, this and that, sovereignty as people will call it, etc., etc. But that's not the job of the regulator. If the regulator begins to get into that space, they're getting themselves mixed up. Those are my views.
Thank you. Kindly use the chat section or the Q&A section, or you raise your hand and we'll give you an opportunity to ask your question.
Yeah, and just to add, Sarata, there have been also conversations, for example, at the regional level, to say, could ECOWAS, and there's a time I was having a conversation with folks from the World Economic Forum to say, if you want to support IPD Dakar to be competitive, or a manufacturer in Kenya or a manufacturer somewhere else, in terms of the market shaping, why don't you help those regions to have skin in the game? So rather than that manufacturer being seen as just a Senegalese manufacturer, why can't ECOWAS as a community collectively invest in that manufacturer and have equity in that manufacturer? So if the whole of ECOWAS owns 40% of IPD Dakar, then they see those vaccines as their own. They have equity in that, and will encourage those vaccines to be widely distributed in the region. But those are debates for the market shaping people to have. How do you make sure that these are competitive, they are viable, they're not repetitive? If you look at the data, already the installed vaccine production capacity on the continent exceeds the demand. The EPI demand, I think, is about 14 billion doses, and the installed capacity is about 16 billion, if I remember the numbers, on the African continent. So already the installed vaccine manufacturing capabilities on the continent, if you just take the vaccine manufacturers, it exceeds the whole demand for EPI on the continent. So the capacity that's there is already being underutilized. So vaccine manufacturing is not a trivial game. There's a good reason Denmark does not produce vaccines for themselves, even though they're first world and they have the economy. Norway does not produce vaccines for themselves. They rely on GSK in Belgium and so on. It's a complicated game. But yes, the Institute Pasteur, the IPD, the Serum Institute of India and others have been successful. But you have to study those models very carefully. What did the Indians do for those to be successful? And the size of that continent, subcontinent, 1.3 billion people. Again, you go back to my second slide. Africa is very fragmented. So these are real issues that one has to think about. Otherwise, you make the investment and you will not see the return. You have to be very careful. Yeah.
Yes, David. Now there's another question from my hand, where you have most of the regulators, especially in the NRAs, you'll find they are being evaluated against world standards, etc. But you'll find manufacturing companies where they have the regulatory department, but it's not really supported, or there is no much investment in regulatory affairs in manufacturing facilities across the continent. But at the NRA level, there is a lot of investment in training, etc. And what do you take of this? That as we build capacity in regulatory science, what's your take on the same?
No, I'll just give you information. Actually, that's not it. There could be more, but there's a lot going on. If you look at IVI, the International Vaccine Institute, they're doing quite a lot of training of manufacturers on the continent, and we have sponsored even some to go to Korea for training in biomanufacturing, etc. Our own team at the foundation, our vaccine development team, has a training program with a group in South Africa. I think there is even an investment with KEMRI to support vaccine manufacturers. There is some work funded by the European Investment Bank. You know, there's been quite some effort by the Paul Ehrlich Institute, for example, and others to support manufacturers on the continent, not just regulators. So there are a couple of efforts. Yes, they are scattered. They're not very large, you know, but they are ongoing. I agree, they are not enough. More needs to be done. But the challenge, if you talk, for example, to the Gates Foundation, you know, if I go, for example, I cannot do it because I work with regulators. I cannot then invest in supporting vaccine manufacturers. But my colleagues who are on the vaccine development side and work with developing country manufacturers, they like to structure capacity building around a project, not capacity building for capacity building's sake. You know, at the Gates Foundation, generally our leadership doesn't like when you use the word capacity building, they walk out of the room. You know, you start with a project and say, Kenya, this player in Kenya is going to be, for these and these reasons, we are working with them to develop, this vaccine. You know, for example, BioVac in South Africa, one of our teams is working with them, you know, to support tech transfer, including with IVI in Korea to do tech transfer. I think that's complete for a vaccine there. Now, when you wrap around the capacity building, the training of the staff, and so on and so forth, to enable them to an outcome, then people understand. But to just say, these guys in Kampala are very nice, they talk very well, so let's train them. Nobody wants to listen to that. So it has to have an outcome, a very clear, concrete outcome. Otherwise, there are demands from other things. Our leadership will ask and say, how does that compare with investing in the polio program to end polio eradication? So you're competing, you know, with those type of interest, or to bring lenacapavir, the new HIV PrEP, you know, to people at risk on the continent. You know, what are the DALIs that you're going to gain, you know, when you train a bunch of people? So that's that, at least for the organization that I work for. Capacity building for capacity building's sake is very difficult to sell.
Sure. Thank you for such a good perspective. Yes. Give 1 more minute to the online audience to ask your question.
Very good. Either we did a very good job or we didn't do a very good job. We'll take the middle ground here. But great questions, friends here. Really appreciate those coming through and your active participation. Clive, thank you so much for organizing this. Enjoyed interacting with the group here.
Thank you, David. It's been good having you online, and it's been a very insightful session, especially in the greater system in Africa. Yes. Maybe you could make your final remarks, then we close it. Yes.
No, I think we've had a good discussion here. Thank you all very much. just do reflect on these things. I know that for those of you who don't work in this space, it's not a very exciting subject. Regulatory can, for some is boring, but for those who work in it, it can be, it's exciting. But think about how, if you're working in clinical trials, how you can influence the ecosystem, to make it better. Because when you make it better, for example, I work with a group in my job. I also work to try and increase the clinical trial footprint on the continent. And we then run into the same issues, to try and attract funders of clinical trials to bring clinical trials on the continent. For global health, yes, because the burden is here and almost exclusively here. You want to do a Lassa fever clinical trial, or Rift Valley fever clinical trial, or an Ebola clinical trial, or a malaria clinical trial, or a TB clinical trial. The burden is here, so people have no choice. But when you begin to talk about, cancer, hypertension, non-communicable diseases, even sickle cell, where the burden is in Africa, the clinical trials are not happening in Africa for cell and gene therapy, because of the regulatory fragmentation. And then, of course, today, because when you do a clinical trial in Tanzania, you need to show the path to access. You need to demonstrate to the Tanzanian government that those patients, if you enroll people into a study and they get onto a treatment, and it improves their outcomes, how do you assure their access, indeed the rest of the population, to your innovation once you have the evidence and get the marketing authorization wherever you get it, and then the investors are going to be saying, where's the market, So it's a whole of ecosystem issue. But if we can begin to nibble at the obstacles that we can at least deal with, that ethical review, it shouldn't take 6 months, surely, for you to give an answer and say, there are some ethical questions here. And, those are real challenges. The work that people do is voluntary. They have to do exams. They're in the field doing research. Then you're asking them to do the review. It's the same thing. It comes back like we all want to publish, but when the journal send you a publication to review, you're not available. But your publication is also going to be reviewed for free. So we are that change. We have to motivate that change from our institutions, etc., and play our part. If you're a review on the committee, do your job, advocate for that change, advocate for those system improvements. When you work with your national regulator, give them feedback, challenge them, etc., etc. That's how we'll make the ecosystem stronger and better, and attract the type of research, the type of innovations that we want to come, vaccines and others, onto the continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, and thank you very much to everyone in this webinar. We would like to hear about your experiences and what else you would like us to discuss in upcoming forums. Before we close, kindly take a few minutes to respond to the post-webinar survey posted on the charts. Thank you.
Thank you all, and goodbye. Nice chatting.
Bye.